All right, so let's dive right in. We're going to tackle a really fundamental concept from Karl Marx's Capital today. Where does new value, profit, actually come from? A capitalist puts money into a business, and at the end of the day, they walk away with more money than they started with. The question is, how? Where did that extra value come from? Answering this, according to Marx, is the key to unlocking the entire capitalist system. So let's think about this from the capitalist perspective. It's a puzzle. You advance a certain amount of money, you buy your factory, your machines, your raw materials, and you pay your workers. Then, after all that, a product emerges that's worth more than the sum of its parts. So which one of those investments actually created that extra value? I mean, think about it. You absolutely need the machines and the raw materials, no question. Production is impossible without them. But do they, in and of themselves, add more value than they originally cost? Or is the secret sauce, the source of that new value, hidden somewhere else in the process? This is the exact question that Chapter 8 of Capital sets out to answer. Now, to solve this puzzle, we have to reach back to a crucial idea that Marx set up for us in the last chapter. And that's the idea that production isn't one single process. It's actually two different things happening at the exact same time. Every single act of production under capitalism has this split personality. On the one hand, you have the labor process. This is the physical, tangible act of making something useful, turning cotton into yarn. It's qualitative. But at the same time, you have the valorization process. And for the capitalist, this is the one that really matters. It's the quantitative goal of making value grow. The point isn't just to make yarn, it's to make yarn that's worth more than the inputs. It's about making things, yes, but only as a way of making money. Okay, so keeping that dual process in mind, let's start picking apart the capital that gets invested. Marx introduces a brand new way of categorizing it, based entirely on the role each part plays in creating new value. And the first piece of the puzzle he calls constant capital. So what is constant capital? Well, Marx gives it the label C, and it's basically all the non-human stuff. It's the capital you spend on the means of production, your raw materials, the wear and tear on your machines, the factory building itself. All of these things are obviously essential, but the big question is, are they the source of new value? Marx's answer here is a hard no. The means of production, he says, don't create any new value at all. They just transfer their own existing value over to the final product. So, in his example, if you use 10 pounds worth of cotton and your spindle wears down by 2 pounds worth, then exactly 12 pounds of value gets passed on to the yarn. The value is preserved, it's transferred, but it absolutely is not expanded. And this is precisely why he calls it constant. The name isn't random. As he says right here, its value undergoes no quantitative alteration. The amount of value you start with in your machines and materials is the same amount that ends up in the final product. It just changes its form. Okay, so if constant capital is just a value pass-through, we still haven't found our source of profit. The mystery remains. And this brings us to the second and far more dynamic component of capital, what Marx calls variable capital. Variable capital, which he labels V, is the part of the capital that's spent on labor power, that is, the worker's ability to work for a certain amount of time. In simple terms, it's the wages. And that word variable is the whole key. This is the one component that does change its value during production. It has this unique, almost magical ability to expand itself. So how does this expansion actually happen? Well, the process is pretty straightforward. First, the capitalist buys a day's worth of labor power for what it's worth. Let's say it's 3 pounds, which covers the worker's food and rent for the day. Then the worker starts working. In the first part of the day, maybe the first 6 hours, their labor creates 3 pounds of new value. At that point, the worker has created enough value to cover their own wage. They've replaced the variable capital. But, and this is the crucial part, their workday isn't over. They keep working. And in that extra time, they create more value, another 3 pounds. And that extra 3 pounds, that's it. That's the surplus value. It wasn't created by the cotton or the machinery. It was generated purely by the living labor of the worker, in the time they worked beyond what was needed to cover their own wage. For Marx, this is the one and only source of profit. Now, it is absolutely critical that we pause here and make a distinction. You might have heard of fixed versus circulating capital from other economists. It's really important to understand that Marx's categories are not the same thing, and for him, mixing these up makes it impossible to see what's really going on. Look, the old distinction between fixed and circulating capital is really just an accounting principle. It's about how quickly value turns over. Fixed capital, like a big machine, transfers its value to products slowly, over many years. Circulating capital, like raw materials or wages, transfers its value all at once in a single production cycle. But that's all about the circulation of value. Marx's distinction, constant versus variable, is about something much deeper. It's about the creation of value. The only question it asks is, does this part of capital create new value, or does it just preserve old value? And Marx is really blunt about this. He says that if you get these concepts confused, if you mistake his categories for the classical ones, you've made a real understanding of how capitalism works fundamentally impossible. It obscures the very source of profit. Okay, so let's put all the pieces together now. We have our two types of capital, constant and variable. Let's look at the complete formula to see exactly where the surplus value comes from. Let's use Marx's bigger example. A capitalist invests a total of £500. Now, 410 of that is constant capital, C, the machinery and raw materials. That value is simply transferred, so we have £410 of value in the final product from that. The other £90 is variable capital, V, the wages. Now, this is where the action happens. The labor bought with those £90 goes on to create £180 of new value. So you take the 410 that was transferred, add the 180 that was newly created, and you get a final value of £590. So let's be crystal clear on this. You start with an investment of £500, and you end up with a product worth £590. That £90 of profit, what Marx calls surplus value, or S, has a very specific birthplace. It is a part of the newly created value, that £180, that went above and beyond the cost of the labor power that created it, which was £90. The source of profit is found exclusively in the expansion of variable capital. So to wrap this all up, what are the main takeaways? First, surplus value, the basis of all profit, comes only from variable capital. Second, that means living human labor is the one and only source of new economic value in a capitalist system. Third, the means of production, constant capital, are absolutely necessary to produce anything, but they don't create new value. And finally, getting this distinction right between C and V is for Marx the absolute pivot point for understanding political economy. And this analysis leaves us with a huge and very modern question to think about. If Marx is correct, if all new value can only come from living human labor, from variable capital, what happens in a future of total automation? In a world where constant capital, machines, potentially displace all variable capital, all human workers, where does the profit come from then? That's the powerful question that this theory forces us to confront today.